Hello everyone. A customer had an interesting dilemma when trying to use one of my MIDI controllers. These are joystick based and they send control changes. So the x-axis left and right will send 0 to 127 on that, and then 0 to 127 on the y on a different CC. What was interesting is this works out fine in a lot of situations like pitch bend and modulation and things like that. He had a very specific case though. He is using the Omnisphere 2 software, and specifically the ORB part of that software. And the way that this works is if you have a mouse connected, you basically drop the point on the target, and depending on the distance and the angle, so where you're at on the sphere, if you want to think of it as a sphere, it changes the settings, and they allow you to map this to MIDI controllers. Okay, you need two controllers, one to tell it the angle and one the distance. Now the problem is this regular stick is sending Cartesian X and Y coordinates in effect. So in effect it's sending that. So what is pointed on this stick is not what ORB is going to see. So the user reached out to me and I took a look at it, and I think I have come up with a solution. And this is leading toward a new pro version of these controllers, which I've been playing with. So what I have done on the controller, they're the same size here, is I've added on a switch to each side, and we'll describe both switches. The one on the one switch side, now this is a floating stick, so it's one of those set and it stays sticks, because that's what you want with this particular ORB, right? So what I've added is a switch on the side, and both of these switches are three-way switches. So you could set it to either Cartesian, which is the normal XY, so this will be low high and then low high and then whatever values in between. Or you could switch it to polar mode. And the polar mode, the polar coordinates, this joystick now sends through the 1cc, it sends the radius, so the distance between the center and the point, and then the other cc sends the angle. So polar coordinates are radius and angle, so you have to know two things. One, how far from the center, and then from an arbitrary point, and most of the arbitrary points are at 3 o'clock, what this angle is. So the software on here, so yes, it's a switch, but the real brains behind it is the software. Because there's software on here now that will take this coordinate, let's say this is, X is 127, Y is 127, and it will take the Cartesian, convert it to polar, and then convert that back to MIDI with a 0 to 127 that ORB is going to like. Long story short, when you point something like here at this coordinate, it's going to show up like this in ORB, and like that, like that. So that's the major new thing, is the ability to switch between polar coordinates and Cartesian. Most users are using Cartesian, but there are going to be instances where you're going to want to know the polar coordinates. Well, now we have it with the handy dandy switch to turn it on and off. Now I mentioned this is a three-way switch. Center position I'm utilizing to turn off sending any MIDI commands. So it is in effect a software off switch, because my user wanted to use this specifically for ORB, but didn't want it to interfere with other things if he's working on other things in his DAW. So he wanted an off button without having to unplug everything. So now it has an off button. Well, let's get to one other exciting thing with ORB, and this was actually the more challenging part. Do you like my multimedia presentation here? I have pieces of paper. Someday I'll figure out how to do this for real. But what Omnisphere does for its ORB is it uses a learn. Okay, so you can't just type in your control change number. You can't just type in 20 or 21 or 1 or 7 or whatever it is. It learns it. Well, learning is all great and all, but in the Cartesian standpoint, the slightest little jostle when you're like moving in one direction or the other is going to send signals both ways. It's just the nature of joysticks. So when you're trying to learn X, being very careful moving it back and forth, well, the slightest movement up and down is going to confuse it. And my customer found that out the hard way as he was trying very gently to do it. And with a polar coordinates absolutely always require both values to be sent at the same time. So learn is completely out the window for that. Well, okay, how do we get around that? Well, we've added a new switch here. This switch on the other side allows the user to select what coordinates they want this stick to respond to. Both X and Y, which means normal. So center is normal, it just acts normally. If you switch it one way, it will only send X data. In other words, only one control channel will be sent. If you switch it the other way, only Y will be sent, so only the other channel will be set. So when you're doing the setup in the MIDI learn in ORB, you say, okay, I want it, so they say two different XY planes, angle and radius. So let's say you want you want to do the X, which I have defined as the radius. You switch it to X mode, you learn, you move the stick back and forth. You don't have to worry about jostling it the wrong way because the code in here is only going to send those coordinates, those X coordinates. And the same thing for Y. If you were in Y, it would only send the Y. So when you were doing the Y. So that should resolve the MIDI learn. So once you've learned the X and the Y, and I'll have documentation on X maps to radius, Y maps to angle. It is confusing, I understand, but it's the way that they did this. So once you program the learn for the two learns, then you just set the joystick back to regular XY mode, make sure that it's in polar mode, and you are good to go. So that is what is happening with this this new adding of these switches. I don't know how often the polar and Cartesian switch is going to be used, or the XY for that matter. I think maybe the XY on off may be more frequent. But this got me thinking of making a pro version of this, which would include those buttons, those switches, I'm sorry. So they're three-way switches, so we could program that for different stuff. And then potentially adding a display, because this version with all of the additional switches, all of this stuff is hand soldered. I do this all by hand. This isn't some magical factory that these are built in. These are built on my desk. So I'm going to have the display, and I started printing out one of the new enclosures, so it's going to look kind of like that. So it's going to be really pretty slick. What would I use the display for? Well, for this initial one, I'd probably show the current MIDI channel, like 1 to 16. I would show the status of the switches. So is it polar, is it Cartesian, is it X and Y, or X only, or Y only, that sort of thing. But it also opens up other possibilities that I could display more information to the user versus just the little LED light. And I did also mention real briefly the MIDI channel. One thing I was doing was I'm starting to add a button to the back of these so that you could change the MIDI channel 1 to 16 in the field, and it would save the setting. I've done that on some special orders. As I've been playing with the display and everything, it's just too difficult for me to put that button there. But I will be changing the code now that I have these switches, so that if it's in some, let's say, the off, and you press the button, it will press down on the stick, it'll change the MIDI channel, something like that. And it responds with color codes with the display, it would show on the display. So I will allow field updating. Silly things like that push button were driving me crazy, because you have to fit it in there, make it strong enough, and all sorts of stuff. Sometimes it's the little things that really get you. So, long story short, though this is quite long, this controller now is available in a setup that will send polar and Cartesian coordinates. So it will work with Omnisphere ORB and be happy with ORB's methodology for learning the CCs, the X and the Y, the radius and the angle, good old polar coordinates. So there's your geometry lesson for today, and let me know if you have any questions. Thanks for watching.